Greetings everyone. This is our third video in the Flexible Budgets and Standard Costing series. And in this video, we're going to be specifically speaking to the overhead variances, both variable overhead and fixed overhead variances. We will not be talking about journalizing overhead variances in this video because this is a managerial accounting video. And typically we don't journalize the overhead variances until we get into cost accounting. So we're going to jump right into drawing the diagrams for overhead variances. Remember, for materials we had one chart, and for labor we had one chart. For overhead we're going to have three charts. So I'm going to go ahead and draw those and label them for you. Now, because materials is a variable cost and labor is a variable cost, variable overhead, being a variable cost, looks and acts just like those. So we're going to go ahead and label these pegs. So we have actual quantity times actual price. Now again, if you haven't watched the first two videos, you need to go back and watch those because I actually define each one of these pegs and the pieces that make up each peg in the first video of direct material variances. So you want to go back and watch that. So the middle peg would be actual quantity times standard price, and the third peg would be standard quantity times standard price. The first variance for variable overhead is called a spending variance, and the second one is called, similarly to labor, an efficiency variance. And we also can have a flexible budget variance for variable overhead. Now, fixed overhead is different from materials, labor, and variable overhead because it's not a variable cost. It's a fixed cost. So we do have a chart for it, but in some ways it's actually easier than the others. In some ways it's more difficult because it's just different. So the first peg is just your actual fixed cost. And those are typically given because we typically know our actual fixed cost. The middle peg is simply your budgeted fixed cost. And the last peg is your standard quantity times standard price of your fixed cost. Your variances are called a spending variance. And the second peg is called a production volume variance. And then the last chart is called our total overhead chart, which we're basically just going to sum these variances. Now this last chart is going to have four pegs, and we'll see why that is here in just a second. I'm going to draw some other stuff here along with it. Now we're just going to label all these variances here. So the first one is our spending variance. The second one is our efficiency variance. The third one is our production volume variance. This is our flexible budget variance. And the last one is our total overhead variance. All right, so there's a couple of pieces of this puzzle that I want to discuss. It's a little bit different from what we said in materials and labor. And the first one is actual quantity. So remember when we were talking about materials, when we first started this discussion on material variances or variances in general, we said actual quantity was the materials or actual quantity was the labor, depending on the variances that we're calculating. Well, what is actual quantity for overhead? Well, if you think back to a prior chapter of material, overhead is driven by a cost driver, like labor hours or machine hours or something like that. So in this case, the actual quantity is the cost driver. Whatever that happens to be in your story, that is the actual quantity. Okay, so both these pieces would be the cost driver, the actual quantity. Now, we also define standard quantity, and that is still the definition, what should have happened at the actual level of production that I showed you in video 1 when we're talking about materials variances. However, with overhead, it could be something different. So if one caveat to that rule is when production level is the cost driver, production level, so whatever we're producing, if that happens to be the cost driver, then in that case, actual quantity will equal standard quantity. So in other words, the efficiency variance would be 0. Okay, so again, when production level is the cost driver, so you got to pick that out first. If that happens, then actual quantity will equal standard quantity. And standard quantities are always the same. Okay, these will also always be equal. Standard price may be different because one's for variable and one's for fixed, but standard quantity will always be the same. Okay, so two things you have to remember there. If production level is the cost driver, actual quantity will equal standard quantity. All right, I also want to show you how to calculate these pegs down here in total overhead. Okay, so I'll show you how to do that. It's not always necessary to do it, but I want you to know how in case you need to. Okay, so the first peg, this peg here, is calculated by taking peg 1 of variable and peg 1 of fixed. You add pegs together. So those two pegs will equal your total actual overhead costs. Okay. The second peg is right here, is equal to peg 2 and peg 2. So both peg 2s. And that is called your total budgeted overhead costs. Peg 3 is equal to peg 3 of variable plus peg 2 of fixed. And this is called your flexible budgeted overhead for actual outputs. And the last peg is equal to peg 3 of variable, peg 3 of fixed added together. And that is called your standard overhead allocated to production. All right. Now, before you get all frustrated here with all these dotted lines going everywhere, I want you to understand you don't always have to calculate these pegs. If you're asked for the total overhead spending variance, well, you have two spending variances. If you look at this chart, you have a spending variance for variable, you have a spending variance for fixed. So these two variances sum together because one may be unfavorable, one may be favorable. So if they're different signs, you would get a difference. If they're the same sign, you would add them together, just like we did with materials and labor variances. And that would give you this overall spending variance for overhead. Well, if we wanted to calculate the total overhead efficiency variance, there's only one of them in your chart, and it's right here. So whatever this efficiency variance is, you'll just move it down here to total. If you're asked for the total production volume variance for overhead, there's only one. It's right here. It's in fixed. So whatever this number is, you're just going to bring it down to this slot right there. The flexible or the overall flexible budget variance for total overhead is the total spending variance summed with the total efficiency variance. Now remember, you have to watch your signs because if they're different, you'll get a difference. If they're the same, you'll add them. That will give you the flexible budget variance. To get the total overhead variance, there's a couple of ways you could do that. You could take the flexible budget variance and sum it with the production volume variance. That will give you this number. Or you could sum all three of these variances together, would also give you this. That is how you calculate the overall total overhead variances. So let's jump right on into an example here. Tulsa Paint Company's budgeted production volume for the month was 30,000 gallons of paint. The standard overhead cost included 50-cent variable overhead per gallon and fixed overhead cost of $30,000. Tulsa Paint actually produced 33 gallons of paint, and actual variable overhead was $16,200, and actual fixed overhead was $31,000. Compute the total overhead variance, the spending variance, and the volume variance. So that's that last chart down there at the bottom. So to really do that, we need all of our charts. So right now, push pause on your player, draw all three of those charts, label everything, and when you're done, come back and we'll finish up the problem. All right, so here is what you should have with all of your charts drawn, everything labeled, and now we can calculate all of these pegs and these variances. So the first one is your actual variable overhead. Well, we really don't have to calculate this one because they actually tell us in the story what my actual variable overhead is. It's $16,200. So instead of just reinventing the wheel here, I'm just going to put that number in there and not have to worry too much about it. Now, we need actual quantity times standard price in peg number 2. So the first thing we got to figure out is actual quantity. So remember, when we're talking about overhead, actual quantity is the cost driver, whatever is driving my cost. So in looking through this, it's not really explicit as to what the cost driver is. But they only talk about one thing in this story, and that's, you got it, production level. So in this case, production level is the cost driver. So remember the stuff I told you about when production level is the cost driver. That's going to be important. Okay, so it says that we actually produced 33 gallons of paint. So actual quantity, what we actually produced, because production level is the cost driver, is 33,000 gallons. And now I need a standard price. Well, they tell me the standard overhead price was 50 cents per gallon. Okay, and these are in gallons, so my price should also be in gallons. So my standard price is 50 cents. So my middle peg cost will be $16,500. And the last peg, now remember, we said when production level is the cost driver, actual quantity equals standard quantity. All right, so I'm going to bring over the standard price first. All right, now I'm going to show you why they're equal. So remember the definition I gave you in video number 1 for standard quantities, what should have happened at the actual level of production. Well, the actual level of production is 33,000 gallons. Production level is the cost driver. So instead of saying how many yards of material should I have used per chair or how many labor hours should have been used per chair, in this case I'm asking how many of whatever I'm producing should I have produced for each item I produced. So in this case, it's gallons of paint. So for every 1 gallon of paint that I produced, how many gallons should I have produced? Well, the answer is 1. So that's how we can say that if production level is the cost driver, actual quantity will always equal standard quantity. Okay, so our standard cost will be $16,500. So again, our efficiency variance, we already know, is 0 in this instance. All right, so let's calculate our spending variance here. So the difference in pegs 1 and 2 is $300. And the only difference in those equations is price. And since the first peg is less than the second peg, my actual price must be lower than the price I thought I would pay, even though I haven't calculated it here. I don't have it there, but we can assume that from the numbers I'm given. So this would be a favorable variance. So my overall flexible budget variance for variable overhead would be $300 favorable. All right, let's move on to fixed overhead. So peg number 1 is the actual fixed cost. So they give me those. Let me do a different color here. Fixed overhead was $31,000, actual fixed overhead. So we'll put that in our chart here. And our middle peg is our budgeted fixed overhead, and they tell me that the standard overhead fixed was $30,000. So remember, standard is like a budgeted number. So this was $30,000. And then the last peg, we already know one piece of this because I told you when production level is equal to our cost driver, our standard quantity is equal to actual quantity, And I also told you that whatever you calculated the standard quantity for one was the standard quantity for the other. Those were the two important pieces I told you about overhead. So in this case, we're just going to bring down that 33,000 because we've already calculated that one time. But we don't really know standard price. And if we look in the story, that's not really given anywhere. However, if we go back to the middle peg, we have budgeted cost of $30,000. Well, what is that $30,000 based on? How many gallons of paint did we budget for? Well, we budgeted a production level of 30,000 gallons. So that budgeted $30,000 is based on 30,000 gallons times a price equals $30,000. And that's our budgeted or standard price, which is $1. So now we have found our standard price. So sometimes you may have to come over here to find this standard price of $1. Okay, so that gives us our standard cost of $33,000. Okay, now we can calculate our variances. So the difference in pegs 1 and 2 is $1,000. And our actual costs are higher than budgeted. That's not a good thing. So that will be unfavorable. And the difference in pegs 2 and 3 is 3,000. And this one we have to pause for just a second. Think about this. Is it favorable or unfavorable? Now think about this. This is a production volume variance. So really what you want to focus on is your production level. And we budgeted that we would produce 30,000 gallons of paint. We actually produced 33,000 gallons of paint. So we produced more than we thought. So this production volume variance, therefore, is favorable. All right, so now we've got our variable overhead variances and our fixed overhead variances. Now we can calculate our total overhead or overall variances for overhead. And I'm going to start with just the variances so you can see that you don't necessarily have to calculate those pegs all the time. So the spending variance would be, in this case, we have two spending variances. We have a $300 favorable for variable overhead, and we have $1,000 unfavorable for fixed. So since they're different signs, we would get a difference in the two, and the difference would be $700. And we bring down the one or the sign with the highest number, and that would be unfavorable. We only have one efficiency variance. It's right here. So we're just going to bring that down to our overall efficiency variance. We only have one production volume variance right there, so we're going to bring it down to our production volume variance. Our flexible budget variance would be the spending variances and the efficiency variance combined. So that would be 700 unfavorable. And the total overhead variance, two ways you can get that. Take the flexible budget variance, which is unfavorable, and sum it with the production volume variance, which is favorable. So that gives us a $2,300 favorable total overhead variance. Or you can just sum all three of these main variances together. So you have a $700 unfavorable, 0, and $3,000 favorable. So $700 unfavorable, $3,000 favorable equals $2,300 favorable. Now let's bring down our pegs like we did before. All right, so the first one is our peg 1 and peg 1 added up. So that would give you $47,200. Peg number 2 in the overall is peg 2 of variable, peg 2 of fixed added up. And that would give you $46,500. Now the difference in pegs 1 and 2 should equal that 700 unfavorable that you got right there. Okay, that's the way that you kind of check yourself. And peg 3 is peg 3 of variable, peg 2 of fixed added together. And that would give me $46,500. And the last peg, which would be peg 3 of variable, peg 3 of fixed added up. and that gives me 49,500. So again, the efficiency variance should be the difference in pegs 2 and 3, which it is. That would be 0. And the production volume variance should be the difference in peg 3 and 4 right there. And that would be how you calculate all of your overhead variances. Now, once again, in a managerial accounting course, we do not journalize your overhead variances. You will learn how to do that in your cost accounting course. Don't forget to give my video a thumbs up if you found it helpful. Also, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and therefore you would get announcements of when new videos have been uploaded. Also, please visit my website at theaccountingdoctor.com, where you'll find other interesting accounting information, games, lecture notes, and even more videos.